OG Rose, and we're going to be resuming our readings of Belonging Again 2-1. And we're going to start with chapter 4 of book 1, 2B. And we've already read 1B, 2A, which talks a lot about Gödel's systems and subjects. And we're just going to pick up where we left off. And as a reminder, I will not be editing these videos. And I'm going to be editing the book as I go. And so there may be pauses here and there, but just wanted to read through it. And you can pick up this book at Amazon. All purchases and reviews are deeply appreciated. You can also find other books like The Conflict of Mind, The Map is Indestructible, our short story collection Under the Wing. All purchases and reviews are really, really appreciated and mean a lot. So let's begin. How do we have the strength to do the non-rational? A question which brings to mind Lev Shestov's Impossibility and also The Conflict of Mind by O.G. Rose. And Shestov was kind of the main teacher um, of Fondaine, Benjamin Fondaine, who had a wonderful series talking with Davoud and John about. And also the great Dr. Sandler has some great work on Levi Shestov. But they both kind of, Fondaine and both of him kind of say that basically without the impossible, humans are doomed. They get kind of trapped by their rationality that we have to believe in the impossible, or there's a certain sort of enclosure that sets. And I would certainly consider Fondaine as a member of the modern counter-enlightenment, warning about the tendency of rationality to enclose itself. A term I've also seen in systems thinking, bounded rationality, that we're all prone to bounded rationality, and that can bind us and lead to all sorts of problems. But anyway, how might we do what seems absurd and ask what is human before AI versus only use AI to avoid what's difficult? How might we use technology to extend humanity versus replace humanity to suggest Illich? And that kind of question is one I associate with Ivan Illich. Well, it might require communities and relationships which could help strengthen us, which is to say, we might need absolute communities. But isn't that a chicken egg problem? Don't we need to make non rational choices to be absolute knowers? So, how could there already be absolute communities to help us make those choices? Perhaps like the chicken and the egg, individuals and communities arise together emergently because that is what the historic moment requires. So that's kind of a lurking question. What comes first? The conditions that can indirectly train us into childhood or absolute knowing, to use that Hegelian terms, or do the children have to come first to make those conditions? And the answer is both, but how is it both and what does that look like? And I think that gets into why you have to have history. You have to have this developmental logic in the works. But anyway, the invention of AI cannot be reversed. For even if we ban the technology, the idea of it has already entered our minds and impacted us into asking, what is human? What is intelligence? The conceptual change is done. Thought has already been transformed. And it will be tempting to use AI to avoid thinking for ourselves, to offload moral choices to the AI, like Alex Ebert warns about, and we had a net conversation about that. Maybe AI in Jerusalem as a play off Eichmann in Jerusalem by Hannah Arendt. I think that was the name of that episode. And then claim I only did it because the AI told me to, and so on. And numerous examples could be made. To be a white box instead of asking the AI what we should do. The question is if we can stand before AI and ask, how am I given that? Rather than use AI to escape ourselves, can we use AI to reflect back on ourselves, which is to ask if we can use AI to go deeper into negativity versus try to escape it? I think this will prove a great and difficult challenge, for our natural response to negativity and tension is to assume this shouldn't exist. To interpret such as a box that we require in order to be a white box is not natural at all. We naturally use technology to avoid negativity. The idea that we would use technology to press into negativity, that's a non-rational thought. And what do you do if you have a people who can't even think the non-rational, not habituated into it? But to resume, unfortunately, adding to the likelihood we make this effacing mistake, The conditions which arise to tension in us have no easily identifiable physical cause, only adding to the impression that tension shouldn't exist. And that was a quote from Cadell's book. To grasp why tension is fundamentally part of being, we likewise have to accept that things which lack apparent physical cause are also part of fundamental being, which is a metaphysical shift in thinking that will not be easy or natural. It's more natural to believe that we should simply ignore or erase the symbolic order which causes this tension, but Cadell stresses that we should rather work through it. He writes, suggesting affliction, AA, and now this is a quote: absolute closures are doomed to equilibrium because no matter what field they exist within, eventually the environment will change so much that their knowledge structures will no longer be fit for action. Thus, eventually, they will hit a state of equilibrium, but the self organizing symbolic drive in itself will continue to participate in the strange loop between chaotic information fields and ordered knowledge practices that are best suited to explore these fields. Goodell asks us to imagine that we might only exist because something doesn't work, which is to say, because something fails to achieve equilibrium and a stable state. Because of this failure, infinite creation and development becomes possible, a blessing of lack like the possibility of intrinsic motivation, but at the price of us having to live with a difficult and heavy tension. Are we so sure this isn't the case? Regardless, we need to face this question directly, for we moderns are currently thinking and designing our systems assuming a truth versus an absolute, and that's a distinction we've gone over with Goodell. And if we cannot escape self-reference, now, ready or not, we will face our box one way or the other as either white or black, as mystery or ever meta, to allude to my discussion with Matthew Allison, episode 139 of season 1. And also, the question of truth or the absolute is a question of if our moment right now before our AI calls her will be the end of true history or the beginning with negation sublation of absolute history. And that's also going to get into Andrew and Alex's work on storytelling and Calzer. But for now, we will resume. Though we spend a lot of time blaming the system for our plight, what is being suggested here is a world in which we are forced to confront our pathologies precisely because we are the system per se. And so, what the system does to us is what we do to ourselves. We easily enjoy believing that the system holds us back. What will we do when we must take responsibility for ourselves and our desires? Perhaps we want a subject object divide because then we could say that objects are in our way. Is the age of scapegoating objects over? Society can be seen as partly in the business of helping us vent and manage Lacan's real in a way that we can handle. And perhaps a day is coming where we must learn to handle a much weaker ventilation system, which is to say, we must learn to handle more reality directly. As scientists might enjoy entropy, so we might enjoy the system, similar to how people can enjoy conspiracies, as described in Desire's masterpiece by O.G. Rose, which is going to talk about Hunter Coates' book, and that is found in The Map is Indestructible. Another reason we might entertain this enjoyment is because belief in a big other system can help us avoid accepting essential incompleteness, because if there is something wrong with life, we can externalize that lack to something we can solve and correct. But if we and systems are unified, then the shortcomings of the system suddenly become ours. And in that move, we have to accept that living systems are in a permanent state of imbalance. And that means we are as well. Incompleteness is a systemic feature of our existence, and thus cannot ultimately be resolved or reconciled by any ideological closure. And these are quotes from Cadell's book. Thus, if we are forced into self reference today, the average person is increasingly forced into facing and experiencing their essential incompleteness, regardless if they are prepared. How might the majority respond? Pathologically, in all likelihood. But this step of self reference is also the beginning of the road for us to become children and intrinsically motivated. And another term for that will be drive later on. Might we make the most of including all of subjectivity into the truth of ontology, of thinking of technological singularity as an event, of considering that thought itself, might be the crucial agent that could prevent the collapse of the universe in heat death, that we are responsible for dreaming. Science with technology has brought us to a place where we are forced to confront our own interiority and decide if we will continue to bracket it out from our thinking or incorporate it more deeply to a place where subjectivity essentially shapes and transforms our world, moving us into AB from AA. Science today suggests problems in which we are entangled, and how those problems are tangled is determined by us. Cadell Last also notes that it is impossible for us to think without thinking, according to assumptions, a certain paradigm, and the like. And so we must decide before we think, non rational, if we believe subjectivity actively shapes reality or is only an observer of it, suggesting how affliction and maps form and work, which are discussed throughout O.G. Rose. To follow Cadell's lead is an act of mentai divergence from truth to absolute, as land waits. If awareness changes how reality unfolds, learning such risks causing us existential misery, if not insanity. But not learning this is also risky, for we might continue to design subjects out of being. We might be dealing here with something as difficult as lucid dreaming, of realizing we are in a dream without waking up. As Cadell puts it, the essence of the mental paradox in relation to the ideology of scientific materialism and fundamental laws can be formulated simply. Subjective mind or consciousness has internal to its own nature the capacity for real time computations that are not reducible to past programming. In other words, subjective mind is not absolutely determined from past cultures. We can think problems that have never been thought before. We can, we're not just bound to think what we've thought and concluded and solved in the past. We can think about new problems and make computations about new problems live right now, which would suggest our computation, our thinking, although computation and thinking are not similes, but this would suggest it is not bound to past causes, which is important because it would suggest that, therefore, a reductionist account of human beings is going to be missing something. Anyway, how do we live with this knowledge and possibility? Well, it won't be natural for moderns, but if we fail to incorporate the work of Bertalanffy into our thinking at great risk, but we fail to incorporate the work of Bertalanffy into our thinking at great risk. This is Cadell. Bertalanffy saw the emergence of a true symbolic drive as something that did not conform to the Unitarian closed loop derived from biological metaphor, AB over AA. But we can still choose to treat symbolic drive as utilitarian, causing a mismatch which breeds pathology and self-effacement. Is subject now another word for system, and system another word for subject? Is object another word for subject? These are questions we can feel left with after Cadell's book. If so, again, the line between thinking and dreaming is now much thinner. And this might sound wonderful, but a dream we have to acknowledge is our own could be a nightmare. And this topic will come back up when we discuss dream equality and belonging again to two, which is a major idea that um, human thinking is naturally toward being a dream. Like that's what it kind of, in a sense, wants to be. It wants to make all of reality dreamlike. And this is the essence of fungibility for communism, and you could argue that of Marxism, I mean. And this fungibility is also the logic of abstraction, autonomous rationality, and so on. But anyway, these are questions we can feel left with after Cadell's book. If so, again, the line between thinking and dreaming is now much thinner, and this might sound wonderful, but a dream we have to acknowledge is our own could be a nightmare. I read that twice. We can always claim a dream is outside our control, and if it's lucid, we can say it's arbitrary. But what about real dreams that others will see we dreamed? What about having to really face what we want and letting others see as well? What about a world of radical social nakedness? Are we ready for that reality? A dream we really choose might always be a nightmare, but this is the kind of world we're heading toward, where technology enables thinking to realize itself as more dreamlike than ever before, suggesting thinking here and thinking there by O.G. Rose, which is a paper we end up incorporating into Belonging Again to, but you can find it on Substack and Medium and all that. But in that very state, we might be horrified by the subjectivity which enables us to dream, precisely because we will have to face our dreams and own them as our own. We will have less plausible deniability for not knowing what we want and having it, which will force us to face and know ourselves and all the real that comes from us, perhaps tempting us to solve the subject by solving it away, an effacement drive. But where thinking is freer from immediacy to dream, it becomes possible for us to think dream beyond Plato's cave and act on our own, non-rationally, menti-divergent, for dreams can help free thought from what's typical. So there's something here where more dreamlike thinking could also help us figure out how to leave Plato's cave on our own, which is an overarching problem. The self-organization of the symbolic order is likely in itself impossible to stop. The question is only how we will try to organize it. Will we deny the active role of the subject? That will be natural for us, for knowing the subject requires a processing of negativity that will prove painful and possibly traumatic. We will have to accept that a perfect future is impossible, only a future we create, which burdens us with possibility. If the human is the product of a mistake, the future can only be perfect without us, and thus we are tempted to think of a future that is post-human. As Cadell notes, could it be that theoretical physics in the mathematical abstraction of a higher, other eternal world qua multiverse is unconsciously expressing a deep desire, uh, is unconsciously expressing deep desires of the biological organisms and cultural creatures engaged in this activity? So when you talk about the multiverse, is that saying something? Is that saying something libidinal? Is that saying something about desire? Science seems to have a subconscious dislike of the subject, precisely because science cannot solve it, per se. Thus, it is possible that cybernetic and transhumanist talk of a future in which AI replaces humanity might reflect a subconscious desire to solve the problem of the subject by removing subjectivity from the universe. Are not scientists human beings with minds just like the rest of us? Can't they be susceptible to the death drive too and afflicted undergo self effacement? Have we even considered this possibility? That current widespread notions about the future might simply be scientific wish fulfillment to overcome the subject once and for all? Might we just be desiring a utopia where there is nowhere for us and claiming it is inevitable so that we can deny the role of desire and subjectivity in its construction? Might we be tempted by the bystander effect? As science might subconsciously desire to remove the subject to solve away the problem of the subject, the same desire could lurk in the background of systemic, institutional, and societal design in general, all organized by affliction and discourse. When we build a community for the people, we might subtly build it in such a way to get people out of the way, suggesting what people need is a way to overcome their subjectivities, which of course we cannot rid ourselves of without ceasing to be. The trial was perhaps a story of Joseph K. getting himself out of discourse's way as discourse would have it. To help people, we might try to remove them. To get people out of the box, we might remove them from where they need to be. Help isn't always helpful. So now we're going to start 2C of chapter 4. And yeah, I mean, Cadell does a very good job in this book of discussing how things that are supposedly objective that don't involve the subject is nevertheless potentially an expression of the desire of the maker of the system. Like, what does um what does belief in the multiverse say about the desires of someone who believes in the multiverse? Or does the idea of the multiverse say something about the desire of the person who made the multiverse? We kind of tend to not think about science as expressing something about the desire of the scientist because we think about it as objective. But the point that Cadell is getting at is that it is a mistake to ever think that what people make or their projects or their theories have nothing to do with desire or who they are as subjects. So if you bracket out the subject, you really leave out a key component in the formation of that which you're bracketing out the subject to consider. And it may make you vulnerable to accepting things blindly or with a lack of critical examination that you actually shouldn't be so quick to absorb. There's something about taking desire seriously that can be taking the thing seriously. So if you bracket out the subject, you might bracket out a means to take the thing seriously. And yet again, ironically, we can bracket out the subject precisely because we believe doing so helps us take the thing seriously. And it's a problem. But I will now resume with 2C of chapter 4, book 1, on the notion that the subject actively participates in reality. If we decide that things don't exist, only relations, as Owen Barfield I would say Leibniz or Hegel might encourage us, because things are idols in the sense that they cannot provide their own grounding, then we will easily be led to think against sociological givens, for everything solid will come under suspicion. This is arguably a good thing, but we might also be at risk of committing the fallacy of Chesterton's fence, which is to say, we tear down something before we know what with what we will replace it. To cease living in a world of things means that I live in a world that my presence in shapes and transforms directly in ways I'm likely not fully ready for. And that makes me more responsible and active in the world than I might be ready to face. This can be difficult to experience and bear, but though I might lament the system and how it inhibits me, I might also be terrified to live in a world where I can't say the system or this object is so readily holding me back because I am more part of it than I previously thought. We dislike the system, but we might dislike being part of it more. Um, yeah, we dislike the system, but we might dislike being deeply part of it more, because that might suggest we have more agency and thus not as much plausible deniability. Peter Berger teaches that we are all existentialists now, and the emergence of AI seems to force the majority of people to reflect on what is human. This is to say, the majority is now forced to engage in self reference, and this is the box which none of us can escape. The question is only if the box will be white or black, which might be tied to the question of if self reference can be the grounds of a new kind of given after the loss of traditional givens described in Belonging Again, Part 1. This might suggest philosophy itself could be this possible given, which then suggests something like absolute knowing. Might it be that AI will be a forcing function that brings the average person to being philosophical and childlike? Perhaps. And then the question would be if a certain mode can provide givens. Again, perhaps not in the same way as traditionally implemented, and perhaps only with voicecraft training. And of course, we have to explain what all that is. To have to reference ourselves is to find ourselves having to be conscious of ourselves. And as Alex Ebert stresses, consciousness is primarily in the business of becoming unconscious. To be conscious regularly and constantly is psychologically and existentially very demanding and overwhelming. Perhaps the role of philosophy is precisely to be in the business of helping us live with constant consciousness of ourselves, denied a success of thought, of unconsciousness. How this occurs for the majority could be precisely because AI and technology forces us to ask, what is consciousness? A question drawn to our attention precisely because AI has us constantly ask, what does it mean to be human? Feeling stuck, conscious about consciousness, and or conscious that consciousness doesn't seem different from AI is precisely being stuck in a box. But to suggest negation sublation, we must be in a box to create, as we must be a whole so that a river comes out of us. Perhaps as a white box, we must create. The only thing we cannot change is changing. Yeah, and the elaboration on this idea that we're now in the loss of givens might be important, because humans have to operate with givens. So when we say there's the loss of givens, it doesn't mean that people don't have something like givens, something that functions like. And then there are also kind of different. What's the difference between capital as a kind of Marxist fetish axiom, given? I would stand by the idea that we've lost givens because we now experience things as contingent. Like you have to assume, say, a shared language when you talk to people. You don't get together and decide what language you're going to share. Marcus is right about that. But then there's also another way in which we increasingly know that we could speak in a different language, and the fact that we do not may somehow be an ethnocentrism that is exclusive, right? That it excludes. So even though we have to practically still have givens, we don't technically still have givens in the sense of they're not even things we question or think to question, nor do we even like think we like there's no kind of even like ethical possibility of thinking them. So there's something about the phrase of the loss. And so what's being suggested here is that self-reference, reflecting back on yourself, is increasingly becoming something that defines people's lives. It becomes given in the sense that we're all existentialists now, but it's not given in the same way that it operates as something thoughtless that you don't have to think about. You just kind of carry through. It's given, it's practically given in the sense that it is extremely difficult to live life in the world today, the modern world, without encountering something which would cause self-reference. But we might, you know, the loss of givens is a phrase that I think some expansion on could be useful, and maybe we'll talk about that with belonging again to one. And there are in 2-2, there are different sections that will talk about that. But yes, we've lost givens because even if we just absorb our Christianity, we come to realize we could have absorbed Hinduism if we were born somewhere else. So even if we must practically treat Christianity as given, it is not technically given. There's a difference between the practical and the technical. Um, and the practical is arguably more real than the technical, of course, but there's still a different relationship of the subject to what they believe after the loss of givens, even if they still have to operate as if things are given. And it's impossible for humans not to live as if things are given. But anyway, self-reference brings about a different mode of being in the world, and it can inspire us into developing skills and abilities, bringing Ivan Illich to mind, which might align more with negentropy than entropy. Generally, the shift from searching for a ground, which defined much of modernity, to developing skills, modes, relations, and so on, perhaps more metamodern, seems central, and in this we might see the possibility of a new consistency that doesn't rise above change, simply thanks to transcendence, and which is more impressive. And which is more impressive, a constant in the midst of change or a constant above change as transcendent? This can be debated, but the point is that if we today are emphasizing skills and modes, then we might be capable of a consistency that has not been historically needed before, a step that might even be a negation sublation. We've traditionally conflated consistent and transcendent, but that doesn't need to necessarily follow. With the right skills, we can provide our own consistency, something like a musical harmony. Now, the map is indestructible. We'll talk about the trade off between consistency and correspondence. But this kind of consistency that we're talking about here is something about a reliable response to surprise in the unknown, that there's something reliable on how the subject is going to respond to the unexpected, which is different from ideological consistency of a map. But anyway, being a white box is more about finding the right mode versus the right ground, but realizing and engaging in this mode will require us to overcome the pressures and tensions of being in a limitless box, which can easily feel like a prison. In a way, the modern world seems like a prison which forces us to self reference and thus be existential. But as Saussure taught us, we can be free in a prison based on our choices and orientation to the prison, so we can find a mode that makes us toward the world in a way that changes how it creatively unfolds. And so can self reference be a new kind of given? If AI in the horizon of the moment forces us to be self referential boxed, might this help us address some of the concerns of belonging again? Part one. Indeed, part one suggested that the loss of givens has proven consequential, and we also cannot return to givens as classically understood. A negation sublation is needed, seemingly one that moves givenness closer to the individual subject. Hence the focus on Hegel, Deleuze, Nietzsche, and the like. Might the necessity of self-reference be part of what we need? If self-reference is part of the box, then makes it possible for us to for each of us to be a white box, then I think so. But perhaps we need the self-reference precisely so that we can engage in self-forgetfulness, because words we cease saying generates a different quality from a state of constant silence, indeed. But what is meant by this will be expounded on later. It suggests we must employ meta to master mystery, as I discussed with Matthew Allison, but to use meta is to risk falling into ever meta. We must walk through inferno and risk stopping. So there is something here where there's been this emphasis in, say, libertarianism or Austrianism on the individual and the rights of the individual and the centrality of the individual. And there's a way in which what that seems to be getting at something true, but what is being suggested here is rather than a metaphysics of the individual, we might get the benefits without the negatives a little more if we let the individualism, quote unquote, follow from the self-reference. If the self-reference leads, and in a world where we're all philosophical now, where we're all existential now, that can become more plausible and doable. But anyway, To be forced into self-reference is going to force us to confront our wants and desires more. And we will also be forced to know that other people know our desires and wants. What we want says something about who we are, and we often don't want others to know who we are, as we often don't want to know such about ourselves. If we are stuck self referencing and thinking is more like dreaming than we often realize, though, then we cannot more so be whoever we dream to be, which sounds liberating, it is. But, well, then we can more so be whoever we dream to be, which sounds liberating, it is, but it's also terrifying. We'd have to own our wants, which we are likely to respond to with anxiety or in a hard personality, which doesn't question our wants, just wants them, because that would open us to anxiety. We might employ a hard personality. We must resist responding to being boxed with being closed off, but how? Not easily. And if philosophy is about knowing itself, it makes sense why Lacan thought of himself as an anti philosopher, for he taught that we do not want to know ourselves. But imagine if we must know something, if we were to be stuck in a box, how could we respond? Um, but imagine if we must know ourselves, if we were to be stuck in a box, how would we respond? Could we take the pressure? If we could, Cadell suggests we might prove sources of negentropy and creation. So if we can handle the pressure and the tension, that opens possibilities that otherwise might not be there. An address of belonging again will collapse the subject-object divide, which will help us escape affliction into attention. But isn't that strange? If there is a divide, that would seem to make space for attention, but the opposite is the case, especially when we treat what is beyond the divide as that which we can never access, as popular Kantianism has led many into, and so that which is impossible to give attention. Things or others completely divided from us are things which attention cannot essentially change, so things can interact. AAs can bump against one another, but to make a distinction here, I cannot promise I'll hold to, not so much relate to. So they can bump into one another, but not relate to, negating sublating into AB. Of course, if there is no subject-object divide, then things do relate, not just bump into one another, even if they don't know any better. But here we are suggesting that children must know and be aware of this relating, which is psychologically difficult, for we are forced to more so confront desire and risk the real. Please note that to deconstruct the subject-object divide is not to say everyone is one, like a blob, but to say that everyone can relate. The divide is more like a wall, and I cannot really give attention to what is on the other side of a wall. Rather, to deconstruct the divide is to make it possible for me to see others. And though the distinction between me and others is still there, it is now possible for us to relate precisely because we are not the same. If we were, there would be nothing to relate. And we talked about this when we discussed Leibniz at Philosophy Portal in the Global Brain Singularity Conference. I highly suggest that. And all of my understanding of Leibniz is forever indebted to the one and only Anthony Morley. I highly suggest his work. Anyway, this gets into my work comparing Leibniz and Hegel, forever indebted to Anthony Morley, as I discussed at the 2023 Philosophy Portal Conference. But the point is that to remove the divide doesn't erase distinction, but makes it possible for difference to relate, and thus for attention to arise without affliction, AA, Nash equilibria. It is funny that the classic divide entails object, as if we can so easily assume the existence of independent objects. But is there such thing as an object outside a world? Objects are always situated in a physics, and so humans are always situated in a metaphysics, referring to objects. We are always already systemized, but what does it mean that we today know we are always already systemized? This is the challenge Cadell takes on, though admittedly I've hardly scratched the surface of Cadell's last critical book, leaving unaddressed the topics like adjunctive reasoning, the dialectic between coherence and correspondence, the positive limits of Hegel, quantum gravity, Hegelian reconciliation. Nothing I wrote here could express the ideas better than Cadell does himself. The sections on Neapolitan ice cream are notably delightful. Cadell articulates well why our fate is tied to how we relate to systems and subjects, a necessary historic phase that will prove effacing if we fail to sublate it into the next phase, which for Cadell last entails thinking's subject system, versus just subject and system. We need the slash. If we are to some degree controlled by a system, we can still know we are controlled by a system, and then we can know our knowing about the system is controlled, on and on. This meta dimension, which is possible thanks to self-reference, means there is always an excess wherever a subject is present, and the question we must ask is if we will use this excess in favor of negentropy or entropy, mystery or ever meta, rhetoric or discourse. The meta excess of the system seems to be why we are able to steer our system subject in a direction of our choosing, toward blackness or whiteness per se, not instantly or all at once, but the meta excess is why, though we might seem more imprisoned now than free, we ultimately have degrees of freedom. The question is only how we might engage in self-reference, and Cadell himself often models this building. He does not discuss an abstract subject, but often references himself in discussions. Cadell engages not in self-reference per se, but Cadell reference. And I think something similar is what we must all do. We must make gifts of our lives, of our life material, and offer it to those around us so that we might better understand this world in which we live. And you could think of testaments and religions as well. When AI forces us to self-reference, we will be tempted to keep the act as general, to keep the act a general self-reference. But the secret to the mode might be to go deeper, to lean into it, and engage in name reference, your name, or much more definitive. More must be said, but the point is that Cadell has offered us an invaluable model for what we need to do. We must be gifts, a negated sublated given. For if a scalable rhizome with roots is possible, as Cadell has discussed, it seems like it must involve something like this paradox. Since there must always be an excess from the system, as precisely unveiled in self-reference, we are always to some degree potentially free, and freedom is terrifying. If this freedom is to prove negative or sublative, the model Cadell often shows in Cadell referencing might be something we all need to get better at, which is to get better at being gifts, like being there, intersuppositional. The map isn't the territory, but map making is part of it, and our age is one which the territory is shaped by how we read our maps, because this shapes what we do to the territory. The map shapes the territory, as the territory shapes the map formulation. Tension is absolute. Tension is a sign of life. Today, we potentially approach a post-human universe. And how does that idea change and shape us? Like, knowing that, how does that change and shape us? For Cadell, it means we must practice Cadell reference, singularity reference, to allude to Hegel, and this requires great work. If we can only think the future, if we accept that we must think us. If we cannot think the future with us in it, the future cannot be ours. And if systems and subjects are indivisible, that ironically means the future is for nothing human or human-made at all. Unless, that is, we can think the future with subjects and systems together. With Cadell's guidance, not only can we rise to this challenge, but I think we can also prove all the better for it. A future which overcomes challenge is greater than a future which merely lingers on. But the challenge we must overcome is spreading childhood, which is spreading the conditions which could inspire the majority to become menti-divergent, AB, and leave Plato's cave on their own. Is this possible? Because we cannot know ahead of time, there is risk and thus possible courage in taking on the challenge. The one who fears an affliction is not made perfect in the surprising love of attention. Now I'll bring us to the end of section 2 of chapter 4 of book 1. And I do suggest very much Systems and Subjects by Cadell Last. We will next be starting section 4 and section 3 of chapter 4. And again, you can pick up Belonging Again 2-1 on Amazon. All purchases and reviews are deeply appreciated. I would highly suggest part 1. And thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate you being here today. Thank you so much, and all the best.